In this segment, we're going to consider some of the historical intricacies of slavery and racial perceptions within the United States and contrast them with those in other parts of the Americas. Our exploration will reveal that the institution of slavery and the construction of race were not monolithic, but varied significantly across regions. This section augments some of the issues raised in the assigned video, The Color of Money. Students educated in American public schools are taught about slavery in the United States, particularly the U.S. South, and are left to assume that the characteristics of slavery in states such as Alabama, Mississippi, or Virginia were representative of the entire institution of slavery. However, this assumption fails to capture the unique nature of slavery in the United States, which was the only nation to sustain a self-propagating slave population. Unlike other regions where the importation of new slaves was necessary for maintaining the labor force, the U.S. slave population was able to grow internally. Race and slavery are two different topics. In the United States, slavery was race-based, but slavery has existed throughout known history, and race is an invention of modernity. The word slave itself originates from the word Slav, a group of people living in southeastern Europe who were recruited by the Ottoman Empire to serve as janissaries, technically slaves, whose purpose was to protect the emperor and who enjoyed significant privileges. Race was invented by Europeans as a way to justify and reinforce their domination over other regions of the world, like the Americas. The British world developed a binary concept of race. This system hinged on the one-drop rule, which posited that any African ancestry, no matter how distant, categorized an individual as black. A person was either black or white. In reality, there is no biological basis for racial categorization in human blood. Blood is a matter of chemistry, devoid of ethnic or geographical markers. The determination of racial identity was thus not a scientific endeavor, but one based on visual assessment. This led to complexities, particularly in the South, where the intermingling of blacks and whites sometimes resulted in offspring who could visually pass as white, despite having black ancestry. In the early United States, the notion of privilege was reserved for a specific subset of the white population, primarily Anglo-Saxon Protestants from England or Scandinavia. This exclusivity evolved over time as various immigrant groups arrived in America. Initially marginalized, these groups, including the Irish, Germans, and later in the 19th century Poles and Italians, gradually assimilated into the fabric of American whiteness and acquired its associated privileges. In contrast, in other parts of the Americas, racial classification operated on a spectrum rather than a binary. In societies with significant populations of indigenous peoples, like Brazil, Mexico, or Cuba, a more complex hierarchy emerged. Here, proximity to whiteness correlated with privilege, and individuals could occupy various gradations on this scale. In a simplistic way, this perception can be illustrated by considering an ascending scale with pure whites at the top and pure Africans and Native Americans at the bottom. The gradations of color between the points leads to different categories of privilege. The system was represented in what are known as casta paintings. These paintings are essentially a form of social documentation that visually represent the complex system of racial classification that existed in Spanish America. They aim to depict and categorize the various racial mixtures that resulted from the encounters between Europeans, indigenous peoples, Africans, and their descendants. The caste system labeled mixed-race individuals with terms such as mestizos, Indio and white, mulattoes, black and white, and zombos, Indio and black, each signifying different levels of societal acceptance and privilege. The racial caste system was not as rigid as in North America. People could move up the racial scale either by marriage or by payment, but no one could by being pure white, and many of the most privileged positions in Spanish America were reserved for whites only. So we see that this false notion of ethnic blood was not confined to North America. The way slavery was approached in British and Spanish America was also different. In Spanish America, the brutal conditions often precluded the growth of a self-sustaining slave population. Slaves were essentially used like we use machines today. Like an automobile, they would be used as long as they were useful, but eventually they would be so broken they could no longer provide value, at which point they would be manumitted. Manumission is release from bondage. Some apologists will argue that slavery was more humane in Spanish America because there was a higher rate of manumission, but freed slaves in this case were essentially let loose to die. They were freed so the slave owner no longer had to bear their expense. Conversely, in North America, the cessation of the transatlantic slave trade after 1807 incentivized slaveholders to encourage reproduction among their slaves, treating them akin to livestock to ensure a continuous supply. The writers of the Constitution included what we call the 3/5 Compromise, which allowed Southern states to count their slave population for representation at the count of 3 for every 5 slaves. The compromise part was that the slave trade would be ended after 20 years. The assumption was that ending the slave trade would lead to the gradual demise of slavery because the slave population could not be replenished. Instead, what happened was that by the time of the Civil War, the slave population was increasing through natural reproduction. The assigned reading of The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is the story of one of these offspring. By situating the United States within the broader context of the Americas, we gain a better understanding of the complex interplay of race perception and slavery. At the same time, we must acknowledge that neither system of racial classification and neither practice of slavery were better. Both were vehicles of injustice, what President John Adams would call an evil of colossal magnitude. Please proceed to answer the questions in the assignment on Canvas. If you have any questions, you can post them in the open forum discussion or contact the professor using Canvas email.